Some elections, they just choose a president, but others, they can literally tear a country apart. Back in 1860, the United States held an election that managed to do both, pushing an already divided nation right past the point of no return and straight into a civil war. It's a really heavy question, right? How can the very act of democracy, of just casting a ballot, become the final spark that makes a nation completely collapse? Well, in 1860, the United States got a brutal lesson in exactly how. Because for about half the country, the results of that election didn't feel like a democratic choice. It felt like an act of aggression. So let's break down how it all went so wrong.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this election, you first have to understand the state of the nation. By 1860, America wasn't just divided. Its entire political system, the very machine that's supposed to create compromise, was shattered.
Honestly, think of the whole country as a tinderbox just waiting for a match. For decades, you had national parties like the Whigs and the Democrats that kind of forced people from the North and South to find some common ground. But by 1860, the Whigs had completely disappeared, and the Democrats, the last big national party, had split right in two over the single explosive issue of slavery. The guardrails were just gone. And this political collapse led to one of the most chaotic elections in American history. This wasn't a simple two-way race, not even close. Instead, you had four major candidates jump into the ring, and each one of them represented a vision for America that was totally incompatible with the others. So let's look at the players. First, you've got Abraham Lincoln. He's the nominee for the new Republican Party, and their whole platform was built around one thing: stopping slavery from spreading into new territories. Then you have the Democrats, who had split. Stephen Douglas represented the Northern Democrats, arguing we should just let settlers decide for themselves. John C. Breckinridge was the Southern Democrat, and he demanded the government protect slavery everywhere. And then finally, you had John Bell, whose whole party was basically pleading with everyone to just ignore the issue to save the Union. And right here, you can see the fundamental problem. On one hand, you have Lincoln and the Republicans saying the government's job is to stop slavery from expanding. On the other, Breckinridge and the Southern Democrats are demanding that the government protect it everywhere. There is absolutely no middle ground there. These are polar opposite, mutually exclusive ideas for the future of the country. So what about the so-called moderates? Well, they were just as divided. Stephen Douglas's idea of popular sovereignty basically just kicked the can down the road and pretty much guaranteed more conflict out on the frontier. John Bell's strategy was even more desperate: just don't talk about it. It was a nice thought, but in 1860, trying to ignore slavery was like trying to ignore your house being on fire. So, with the nation split four ways, Americans went to vote. And the result? It wasn't a mandate for a unified nation. It was basically a mathematical confirmation of just how divided the country had become. When you look at the popular vote, something really crucial jumps out. Abraham Lincoln won with less than 40%. Now think about that. That means 60% of the country voted for someone else. He was a minority president, and you can bet his opponents in the South immediately used that to argue that his election was totally illegitimate. But, as we all know, the popular vote isn't what decides the presidency. It's the Electoral College. And here, the story is completely different. The North's massive population advantage meant Lincoln could just sweep the free states and win the presidency decisively. He got 180 electoral votes, well over the 152 he needed. The electoral map itself was like a grim prophecy of the war to come. And this number illustrates the final fatal problem. From the entire South, the next president of the United States won exactly 0 electoral votes. His name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. For the first time, a president had been elected entirely by one part of the country, basically ignoring the other half. For the South, this wasn't just a political loss. It was proof that they were now a permanent minority, and that their entire economic and social system, a system built on slavery, was at the mercy of a government they saw as hostile. The reaction was immediate, and it was catastrophic. And you don't have to take my word for it. This quote is from South Carolina's own official declaration of secession just weeks after the election. They spell it out in black and white. They are leaving the Union because a man was elected president whose purposes they saw as hostile to slavery. The speed of the collapse was just terrifying. Lincoln is elected in November. By Christmas, South Carolina's gone. And before Lincoln could even take the oath of office in March, 6 more states had already left and formed an entirely new nation, founded specifically to protect slavery.
Look, the election of 1860 didn't cause the Civil War all by itself. Those causes had been building for decades. But what the election did do was act as the final unrecoverable break. It was the absolute point of no return. Because what the math of 1860 really proved was that the North, just through its booming population, could now control the entire federal government without a single Southern vote. The political balance that had held the Union together, as fragile as it was gone. Forever.
So, in the end, the election of 1860 was that final fracture. It showed that the political system was broken. It proved that compromise just wasn't possible anymore. The South was not going to accept being a permanent minority. And the ballots of 1860 were about to be replaced by the bullets of 1861. And that brings us right back to our first question, but now with a whole new perspective. The story of 1860 is this stark reminder that democracy isn't just about voting. It's about accepting the results and finding some common ground. And it leaves us with a timeless and frankly troubling question. When a political system loses its ability to do that, what comes next?